Hello. Welcome to the last of the workshops in 3D-Con 2021. And this workshop coming up is going to be performed by Gordon Au. It's called Artificial Intelligence and 3D Stereoscopy. Gordon is an avid stereographer and 3D experimenter, tinkerer, making stereo photos, stereo videos, anaglyphs, extractions, and conversions, drawing upon a variety of sources, including TV and film, artwork, NASA data, found footage, and more. His experiments include catadioptric stereos, artificial intelligence, slices and shapes, asymmetric framing, video panning, zooming of 3D stills, X-rays, and fog as depth map sources, and more. Gordon is a proud member of and has presented and/or written for the NSA, ISU, New York Stereoscopic Association, Virtual Stereoscopic Community, and LA 3D Club. Go ahead, Gordon.
Thank you, Rick and the NSA team, and thank you all for joining me today. So just a few notes before we play what is a pre-recorded workshop, but this will be available to view later on YouTube. Portions of it are very step-by-step. So if it goes a little fast, don't worry, you'll be able to replay it, and then you can follow along step-by-step doing it yourself using these programs. And also, if you have questions along the way, please put them in the chat and I'll be monitoring that. And then we should have some time for some live Q&A at the end. So thanks very much. And go ahead, Rick. Welcome, I'm Gordon Au, aka World of Depth, and today I'll be talking about how you can actually use several free and publicly available artificial intelligence programs to do handy things like upscale your images, colorize black and white images, and to do 3D specific things like create depth maps and use depth maps to animate images. Alright, so let's start out looking at some examples of what we will learn to produce in this workshop. In this example, we'll start with a black and white photo of a young Mr. Rogers, and we can use AI to do things like colorize it like this. You'll notice, of course, many imperfections here, but compared with the time and energy required to colorize a black and white photo by hand, there's no question that you could do worse than use this as a starting point, for example. We can also use AI to convert this into a fully 3D stereo pair, such as this. When I show these 4 image panels, by the way, the cross-eye view will be on top and parallel view on the bottom. We can also use AI to convert this into an animated stereo pair. And here's another example. If we start with this photo, we can produce an animation like this one. Notice that although this animation itself is 2D, it is based on an underlying 3D model. Rick? So let's look at a chart. Rick, would you please pause this for a moment? This is Gordon. We're going to talk about today and what they allow. We just had a request to turn up the sound, and some folks are reporting seeing a gray bar that's blocking part of the screen in the lower right.
Maybe you want to try to just do a reshare. Oh, that looks good now.
Oh yeah, now it's gone. Okay. Allow us to do. So first, if we start with a stereo pair, you probably already know that we can use Masuji Suto's Stereo Photo Maker and Ugo Capito's DMAG program to create a depth map from that. Now, importantly, it gives us both a left and a right depth map, or what we might call a stereo depth map. So for example, if we start with the image, the stereo photo shown above, and by the way, for these 3 cross images, it will be cross-eyed on the left and parallel on the right, we can produce the depth map shown below. I've rendered these depth maps using the Inferno color map palette to better appreciate the details, and I also edited a little by hand, but nonetheless, that's what you can produce. Once you have that depth map, there are many things you can do. For one, you can take either the left or right original image plus depth map, feed it into SPM, and produce a new stereo pair with adjusted depth. For example, you could take the following somewhat shallow stereo pair and deepen it like so, accentuating the pop-out effect. This is handy with stereo photos taken by devices with pretty narrow interoculars, like the old LG Thrill, which is what I used for this picture, or the Red Hydrogen one. Conversely, if you had a stereo photo with substantial depth and you were preparing to show it via projector, you might produce a shallower stereo pair using the same methodology. Here, by the way, is the depth map from SPM and DMAG that I used to produce this effect. Another thing you can do is use Stereo Photomaker or Photoshop to apply a selective background blur. For example, with this stereo photo, which arguably has a distracting background, you can blur it slightly like this. And this was accomplished using this depth map, which is not perfect, but suffices for this effect. Note that to get this effect in true 3D, you need to use the left depth map to blur the original left eye image and repeat the same for the right. There are many other potential applications, but the final one I'll talk about here is using the AI called 3D photo inpainting to create a stereo animation. Here is an example of a zooming in and out animation of a stereo photo I hope you recognize, and here is the depth map I used to create that. So that's what we can do starting with a stereo pair. But one of the most crucial things that artificial intelligence allows us to do is to do many of the same things, but starting from an ordinary 2D image. As before, the first step is really creating a depth map, and now there are many artificial intelligence programs that will do this. The first one that was widely available that I tried is by Google. The second one is called MIDAS, which stands for Mixing Datasets for Zero-Shot Cross-Dataset Transfer. And the third one, which is so new it didn't even make it on this flowchart, is called LERES, L-E-R-E-S, which stands for Learning to Recover 3D Scene Shape from a Single Image. I'll also talk about boosting monocular depth, or BMD here, which is essentially an algorithm that improves MIDAS and LERES. Here's an example. This is a 2D photo originally by Stephen Pisano, and when we use boosting monocular depth and MIDAS to estimate a depth map for it, we get this. You might notice some small imperfections like the spires of the building leaning too far forward, but the amount of detail and the general accuracy is pretty astounding. Once we have this depth map, we can do many of the same things as on the stereo pair track above. We can't really do the depth adjustment because there's no depth to adjust as this is still a 2D image, but we can use Stereo Photomaker or Photoshop to apply a background blur. For instance, we can take this photo and change it to this. You might appreciate it already, but really the primary reason modern camera phones have depth sensing technology is to do precisely this. In other words, to simulate a shallow depth of field for portrait photos. Here is the depth map from BMD and MIDAS that I used for this effect. In addition to background blur, we can, as before, use the 3D photo inpainting AI to create an animation, albeit a mono animation. This animation I showed earlier was produced this way. And here's the depth map behind it. So those are two applications of a mono depth map. However, if we want to go beyond mono into stereo, we can thankfully feed the original image plus depth map into Stereo Photomaker to produce a 3D stereo pair, and thereby have access to everything on the top of this diagram, even starting with a 2D image, thanks to artificial intelligence. So now let's talk about how actually to use the AIs, and I'd like to ease into this and start with one that is not 3D specific, but that is useful and accessible to anyone. A long-standing problem in graphics is how best to enlarge small images. If we do this with no frills, we tend to get results that are pixelated and/or grainy. Some programs use sharpening or interpolation algorithms to get slightly better results, but still if you zoom in on this one here, you can see it's quite blurry. But now there are AI programs which can recognize lines and contours, and despite some occasional strange connections, will generally and reliably give you superior results. Perhaps the easiest implementation of this is bigjpeg.com, a free browser program. You simply go to this website, select your image to upload, select from several options, which are somewhat limited depending on whether you're a member. Hit the start button and wait maybe a couple minutes, and simply download your now enlarged image. This website allows you to process a few images per day for free and without registering. You can, of course, pay to remove these limitations. And by the way, I'll post in the chat or video description a web page that collects all the links I'll mention today. The other general AI application I'll be talking about is colorizing black and white images. Perhaps the best and easiest implementation is at Deep AI here, where you simply upload your image and it immediately produces a colored version. However, its output is limited to about 800 pixels in size. If you want to work with full-size images or videos, or tweak the numerous settings and options that exist under the hood, then we need to go beyond a simple ready-made website like this and learn how to use the AI more directly. This is where Google Colab comes in. So Collaboratory is essentially a free Google service aimed at students and researchers that lends you an extremely powerful cloud computer, notably one that is advanced enough to train and run the neural networks that underlie many artificial intelligence programs. And technically, you don't even need a Google account to use it, though it does make it more convenient. This is a Google Colab notebook, so essentially a document that contains text and code. Many AI researchers will create public notebooks like this one, so people can try out their AIs. So this one is for the Artistic Colorizer AI by Robinson and Benavente. This is a slightly custom notebook I've made to allow for image uploading instead of just using images at links. But anyway, these blocks here are called cells. These are text cells. And if we just skip down a little bit, this gray cell right here is code in the Python programming language. When we hover over it, if we hit this play button, it will basically run the cell in this code. And if you look at my helpful directions here, what we'll do is basically go to each cell, run the code in it, wait for the code to run, which may take a minute or two, and then proceed down to the next cell. Now for this notebook in particular, we do have to do this first. Follow the directions here. We have to go to runtime, change runtime type, make sure GPU is selected, and save that. All right, so let's start running code. Here's the first cell, and we'll, here we go. And most of them will be pretty quick. We'll see what happens here. Okay, there we go. Starting out, it'll sometimes notify you of the progress, and this one is done. You can see the check mark here, and you can see the spinning progress bar has disappeared. And now we'll run this next code. Just changes a directory. Now we're into setup, and you can optionally read this. This must be the first call, yada yada. Okay, we'll just run it. And depending on basically what time of day you run these and how much virtual computing resource is available out there, some of these cells may run faster or slower. Okay, now we're down to this cell. And note at this one, oh, okay, got a lot of stuff happening with this one. Oh. And you can see here I already have a note. You can ignore the warning produced at the end of this cell above here. So even though this says you must restart the runtime, we're not going to do that for now because it will take too long. You can do that if you want in order to run a newer version of some accessory program, but let's skip this for now. Okay, so now this cell. Okay, and that is done. Now another one. And it is downloading from some third-party websites here. Sometimes the availability of these third-party links, which are, maybe resources that the that the researchers put online, again, you see here, this is from DeepAI, sometimes they may become unavailable, so you might run into errors in Colab notebooks. It's really dependent on of course, the providers, how long they keep these resources available. But hopefully many will stay up for a long time. Okay, this is done. And one more here. And this will be the only notebook that I show you in real time, just to walk through one at least. And we'll see, this one should be, okay, all done here. And now let's go down here. All right, so now I'll be following these instructions below. You can read through these as a reminder if you use this on your own, but I'll just go through the steps. So what we'll do first is click this folder icon on the left to open up a look at our files. Hovering over this de-oldify folder, I will click on the three dots and select a file to upload. Now I've already done that, but what you would do next is click on this triangle to open up the de-oldify folder. Navigate through here to find the image you just uploaded. In this case, here is mine, 2.jpg. Hover over this, click the three dots again, and now select copy path, which is basically the location of your file. Then we can close this if we want. Then we're going to come down here to this colorized cell and paste the text that we just copied in here. And it should start with /content/deal blah blah blah. So this is my file, and now we simply run this cell, and you can change these settings. There's some info on what the settings does above here. You can also turn on or off a watermark. But here's what happens if we just run this. It will process for a bit. And again, this will depend on resources available, but then it should show you your picture right here. And here's a comparison with the original. Now, if we want to save this directly, we can simply right-click, go to Save Image As, or whatever the equivalent is in your browser. And there you go. There's the first Colab notebook we've used. Now, one note, if you're using multiple different Colab notebooks, and in general, it's a good idea after you're done using it to go up here to Runtime, to Manage Sessions, and to terminate your session. So you stop using this virtual computer they've loaned you. If you do not do this, you will not be able to open additional notebooks sometimes. And also sometimes Google Colab will complain about you opening too many sessions. All right, so those were a couple general use AIs. Now let's go on and talk about some 3D AIs, starting with BMD, which is the first one you would use when working with a 2D image. All right, so here is the Google Colab notebook for boosting monocular depth. This is basically an algorithm which increases the detail of depth maps produced by Midas and Lorez. To run this, we're going to follow the instructions here, starting with changing the runtime type to GPU as we did with the last notebook. Then on step 1, we're going to run code section 1, the first cell in gray there. Then on step 2, for putting your test images inside content inputs, we're going to click on the folder icon to the left as we did before to open up the files. Then we're going to hover over the inputs folder and click on the three dots that appear to select upload. And again, we can expand the inputs folder clicking on that little arrow, that little triangle to the left to confirm our files have uploaded successfully. Our next step will be to run code section 2, which will load various files for the AI. And finally, in the third code sections, we can choose to either run this method using Midas or Lorez, or both if you do one after the other. No matter which you run, the output will look something like this. So basically, this BMD algorithm divides your original image up into several patches depending on where it thinks there is the most detail. It processes each patch individually and then reassembles it. You can find the depth map outputs in these output folders to the left here, saved as PNG files, which you can then download. As far as which is better between Midas and Lorez, I think they really have different strengths and weaknesses. So Midas was trained primarily on sets of photographs of people, so I think it does better overall with shots of people. However, as you can see here, it has flattened Mr. Rogers' nose a little bit, though it does a better job of keeping his ears connected to his head, as you can see with the Lorez version. Meanwhile, Lorez does a better job at picking out background details, as you can see perhaps with the dimensionality of that bush at right compared with how flat it is in the Midas version. However, Lorez, I think, can be overactive. If you have a picture of someone wearing clothing with a graphical print on it, or if you have photographs or artwork hanging on a wall, it will go after all of those and try to make all of them 3D. Fortunately, it's pretty easy to test both on any image you'd care to try, and then you can test out the results using Stereo Photomaker or Ugo Capetto's Depth Player, etc. I should note here that these AI depth maps will always have flaws, always imperfections, and whether or not you want to take the time and energy to correct them by hand, I think really depends on your purpose and the final product you have in mind. Editing and correcting depth maps, of course, is the topic for another workshop. But for example, applications like producing a 2D animation or applying a background blur to a stereo pair are going to be much more forgiving of small flaws in the depth maps than, say, producing a 3D stereo pair or a stereo animation. I'll go over one more method for producing depth maps, and that's Midas version 3. So BMD, which we just went over, uses Midas version 2.1. So the difference is that BMD plus Midas will produce depth maps that are very detailed, whereas Midas version 3 will produce depth maps that are a little simpler but probably more accurate. I have found that Midas version 3 depth maps are better for certain applications like making Facebook 3D photos. So here's how to use it. Once again, I've made a custom Colab notebook for this Midas, which will allow you to upload your own images. So you can follow the written directions I have here, but I'll walk you through a little bit of it now. Again, you'll start by running the code in this first gray box, then you'll upload your image by going to the left, clicking the folder icon to open the files, now clicking on this upload button, then you'll find your file, hover over it, click the three dots to copy the path, and then you'll move back in the notebook down below to where it says file name and paste that path here. Again, it should start with /content, and when you run this cell, it will give you confirmation. Next, you'll run several other code blocks before finally getting to showing and saving the result here, where you'll need to enter a file name for the depth map to be saved. When you run this cell, it will display the depth map and save it as shown to the left. One word on the output. You can see this is a colored depth map. This uses what is called the Viridis color map palette, and you'll want to convert it to black and white to get a grayscale JPEG file to use it with programs like Stereo Photomaker. I'll go over one more AI here, and that's 3D Photo Inpainting, abbreviated 3PI here, which you can use to make animations starting from a 2D image and a mono depth map. Or if you run it twice, once for the left eye view, once for the right eye view, you can produce stereo animations. So here's the Colab notebook, and as before, you'll simply run the code cells in descending order. When you get to this Please Upload JPEG Files stage, the cell below actually doesn't work in Firefox and several other browsers, but what you can do instead is upload your files using the methods I've shown before. So you'll want to open up the folder titled 3D Photo Inpainting, then upload your starting image to the Image folder, and upload the corresponding depth map to the Depth folder. Notably, the file names need to match between your image and the corresponding depth map, but the original image needs to be JPEG and the depth map needs to be PNG. If you're feeling trusting, you can skip the depth map and just upload your 2D image, in which case 3PI will automatically use BMD and Midas to create a depth map. However, I highly recommend making the depth map and checking it yourself first. When you run the main program for this AI, it will definitely take a few minutes. By default, it will produce 4 videos, which will appear in the video folder here. Because it's very computation heavy, once in a while 3PI will run out of memory and fail. When that happens, it's usually because your depth map is either too large and/or has too much detail in it. So to fix that, you can try downsizing your original image and the depth map, and also applying a slight Gaussian blur to the depth map, and try it again. It's somewhat beyond the scope of this workshop, but there are also lots of different options you can tweak with this AI. To do that, you have to download this argument.yml file, edit it, and then re-upload it. If you go to the GitHub 3PI page, you'll find configuration information on exactly what the settings are and how you can change them. This is completely optional, but it is handy for things like producing horizontal panning videos, from which you may know you can extract and produce 3D stereo videos. Here's an example of that process. 3PI produced a 2D horizontal panning video, which I then duplicated with a time offset and put side by side to make these stereo videos. Here's another one of 3PI's default output videos, and that's the zoom in video. In this case, I have duplicated and reversed it to create this loop which zooms in and out. Note that these animations produced by 3PI, while based on 3D modeling, are themselves 2D. So you always have to do a few extra steps if you want to convert them to true 3D stereo videos, like with the previous example. Converting this animation to 3D would be trickier than the previous example. Basically, you would have to create a stereo pair of the original image and a stereo pair of the original depth map to create a left and right depth map. Then you would have to run 3PI twice, one for each eye view, and combine the videos. I should mention that it's possible to make similar animations from a 2D image and depth map using just Stereo Photo Maker, and here's an example. However, as you can probably tell, using AI gives a considerably smoother result, as well as making possible a variety of camera movement. And the same considerations for converting this to a 3D stereo video would apply. So that wraps up the AI programs I wanted to walk through with you today. But briefly, here's a look at what's coming down the road. This AI can take any ordinary 2D video, extrapolate a 3D scene from it, and apply 3D video effects. Meanwhile, this one, which promises space-time view synthesis, is even more amazing. I'll play a little bit of the researcher's video.
Our method builds a representation for dynamic scenes from a single monocular input video like the one shown here, which exhibits challenging motion and scene structures. With this representation, we are able to render novel views and times. This lets us, for example, freeze time and move the camera, freeze the camera and move time, or a combination of the two. Our method only requires a single view and can therefore be used on natural videos collected in the wild, as long as camera pose can be extracted, for example using While our method does not explicitly compute depth maps, we can visualize the expected termination depth of each ray, which gives us some indication as to the reconstructed scene geometry, shown here.
That's it. Thank you for listening today, and I hope it's added some interesting and useful tools to your 3D toolbox. I think the future for 3D AI, barring any unforeseen complications, is quite bright, and I'll see you there. So thank you, Rick, and everyone. I know, again, that moved at a pretty fast clip, and actually, I wanted to ask the organizers here if, so I know we need to move on to the next workshop, but will this Zoom session remain open afterwards for questions?
Yes, we can leave the session open.
Okay, so if you have questions for this, please feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can ask them in person following the next workshop. I do see there is a person with his hand raised. Do we want to call on him now?
Yeah, sure, sure.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
Jim Frazier, if you've got a quick question.
Yes, Gordon, I was just wondering if you have any estimate of how quickly these operations would run on a laptop with a high-end gaming GPU, for example, compared to Google's super GPU that's in the cloud?
That's a good question, but I don't really know. You'd have to, well, first, of course, it would depend on which AI program you're running, because some of them are quite quick, whereas some, download gigabytes and gigabytes of information and take even a few minutes to run, even on those Google virtual computers. So it would depend.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Or I guess we can have some more questions for Gordon a little bit later. We have one more workshop in this 3D-Con. It's coming up. And it's called Shooting 3D Tabletops with Webcam and Raspberry Pi, performed by Dr. Guenter Pomaska. And Dr. Pomaska is with us, and he would like to speak a little bit before we play the video that he has created. And you are muted. Can you? Okay, now you can speak.
Yeah, good evening here from Brunswick, Germany. This is a town of the former Rolei company, or Rolei as you say, Rolei. I worked the last 4 years with a Raspberry Pi in stereo. I introduced a photo booth at the Lübeck exhibition. And now I switched to this USB cams. What I have in my hand here is a 4K USB cam. And the aim of this is to encourage people to work with the Raspberry Pi. Because you can learn a lot about computer vision, about Python and about Linux or Linux. And I know that in our community are a lot of people who have experience with Rocky Mountain Basic, for example, and it's very helpful to refresh your knowledge. Let me say some words about the video. It's a total length about 23 minutes. The first 16 minutes, I'll discuss the basics and introduce the process of photo taking with base and focus stacking. Bracketing, sorry, the stacking comes later, and it is followed by a 4-minute software presentation in nearly real time, so you can see how a stereo image with this bracketing procedure comes to the viewer. Finally, we have 2.30 minutes presentation of anaglyphs. You can use this pictures in the HTML5 viewer if you switch to the art gallery, or if you go to my YouTube channel, there are a couple of small video clips with tiny people and tabletop. So Rick, please can you play the video?
Welcome to my workshop about shooting 3D tabletop with webcam and Raspberry Pi. The workshop is about the following topics. Answering the questions, what is tabletop and why should one photographing with a webcam? A short overview about drivers, application programming interfaces and useful apps is given. Camera and computer hardware will be introduced. Next, the photographing working chain has to be explained, featuring the focus and base bracketing. At the end of the presentation, we will reward ourselves with a visit to Captain Scarlett's gallery. Tabletop photography plays an important role for professional photographers. The layperson can work without the need for high-end equipment. So there are applications for hobbyists, collectors and eBay sellers, for example. Macro photography starts at image scales larger 1 by 1. That means an object completely covers the image frame. If the image scale gets smaller, we are talking about tabletop. In general, one can say tabletop photography handles objects small enough to fit on a table. Another point of view in digital photography is the object resolution, the footprint, as we will see later. I'll demonstrate 2 selected examples. Small world photography makes use of things we all know from daily life. Edit the 1 by 83 puppets. The left one you can find in the trailer of your Congress. Workers in overalls investigating the hot pepper. If we place the puppets in a real environment, we are talking about tiny people photography, as you see in the right image. And here you see a typical tabletop, showing a nice Morgan car from UK. Even the first question is, what is it good for? A webcam for 3D photographs? We'll have a look at the pros and cons. Let's start with the pros. A webcam is compact with a lightweight body. It easily can be remote controlled by mobile devices if it has an own driving unit like a Raspberry Pi. The near focus distance, up to some millimeters, and the adaptation of the existing ambient light are the two major reasons for me to experiment with this kind of cameras. Logitech names the exposure control right light function. The USB cams enable focus bracketing and zoom. 4K is available, for example, by the latest Logitech Brio. What are the cons? Applying a 2K camera with the usually wide-angle lens provides a wide field of view, but due to the low resolution, cropping is limited. The wide angle of the lens is not a feature. Talking about resolution, it is useful estimating the object resolution. If the 3.6-inch 10cm Captain Scarlet shown in the introduction is captured with 1000 pixels in height, 1 pixel stands for 0.1 mm of the object. Is this a sufficient object resolution? What if with a close-up? Half the figure, then we come near to 50 microns. Better resolution or already too much? The print size of the final image is limited. Very large formats are not suitable. To a certain extent, synchronizing the two cameras for 3D is a problem. The image shows my prototype of two Microsoft LiveCam Studio cams. I synchronized them with two independent running recordings, using a flash and combining the single images in a further processing procedure. But this is a different story. Let's stay here with the cha-cha. One should not compare the cameras with DSLR or DML or high-end smartphones. What standards or software is available for a kind of plug-and-play installation? UVC, USB Video Device Classes, describes devices capable of streaming via USB. A uniform device driver can operate the devices of different makers. That means a camera that complies to the UVC standard runs on your machine or should run. Video for Linux is a device driver and API for real-time video capture. Usually this driver is on board the operating system and enables the settings via command lines. If you need information about the controls, ask via a terminal command line. This is the information that comes out for a Logitech C920. We don't discuss the settings here, but later some hints for the photographer may be useful. At the test bench, one can use the Q4L2. The graphical interface enables easily previewing of the settings. This tool is very useful for testing controls in advance of your production. A good servant spirit for developing the application software is OpenCV, a computer vision API. Instancing the camera, live preview, stream capture, capturing the image from the stream, displaying the image and writing the image to disk are the methods to perform. This all is done due to OpenCV. Our next topic in this presentation is about the hardware components. Here you see my first standalone complete setup presented at Maker Faire exhibition in 2019. Raspberry Pi 3B, HDMI display, USB keyboard, power pack, and the twin set of Microsoft cams calibrated for 3D recording. Everything fits in a small tin box. Today I prefer the Raspberry Pi 4B headless. That means without a keyboard and monitor. During the booting, the VNC, Virtual Network Computing server, is loaded. The computer is connected to a network, global or local, on a host PC, as well as smartphone, tablet or laptop. The VNC client is called and comfortable operating is enabled. My favorite cameras are the Logitech and Microsoft brands. Currently I'm testing other USB devices. If one asks at this point why not the RPI standard cameras and using the CSI connections, the answer is that those cameras are fixed focus and have a longer focus distance. I tested as well some macro lenses. For particular applications it is worthwhile to try the RPI standard cameras with different lenses or see what the company Erdocam offers. Some LED lights may be necessary. My recommendation is the gooseneck LED mounted on a flash shoe, with those cheap light sources pointing to details in the scene as possible. A macro slider is used for base bracket, as we will see some slides later. A manual and a motor-driven device will be compared. Now it's time to talk about the photographic procedure. At the outset I try to explain the recording procedure step by step. Afterwards the focus and base bracketing is shown in a short screen recording. Starting the camera software displays two panels, one for the exposure controls and one for the camera controls. In combination with the preview window, the correct settings may be found first, and the focus serial starts at the first camera position. The exposure controls come with brightness, contrast, saturation. No problem for a photographer. Finding the correct color illumination is mostly influenced by the white balance, saturation, and the backlight compensation, or the background itself. Consider we don't set exposure time and have no aperture to influence the incoming light. Gain controls electrical amplification like ISO on digital cameras. Exposure absolute, often camera specific, may be the exposure time. Both of them can be used in combination. But for our 3D stills, it is not so important. So let the gain parameter stay in the middle of the slider and the exposure absolute value near the left. Sharpness is the level of the clarity of detail in a photo. It is a tool for emphasizing details in an image. Don't confuse with focus. Export auto value 3 stands for manual mode, value 0 for automatic mode. I could not figure out exactly the other two settings. Here is a comparison between white balance auto, white balance 5500 Kelvin, and some more saturation. We assume that the scene is properly illuminated with some LEDs from left, front and right side. The field of view is 78 degree and covers a wide range of the black background. Outside the region of interest, I put some structured background into the scene. Since the color settings are sufficient, we continue with the camera controls. The camera controls define the project or image name, the suffix, the near distance from camera to the object, the focus range and the step factor, and a zoom value for the image section. The complete file reference is superimposed in the control image, directory, suffix, camera position, focus, extension. All the controls are written to a file for further readings. After the first position, the camera must slide to the neighbor base point, depending on the hardware manually or automatically. The next image series can follow. This macro rail from the company Manx is perfect for very short base distance setup. It is not used for focus distances here. The tabletop setup depicts a changeable background and one LED frame light on the right side. The earlier mentioned gooseneck light on the left and the camera with the macro slider on a tripod. Size of the motif is approximate 4 inch 10 centimeter. Much more useful for automated processing is a camera mounted on a linear actuator driven by a step motor. You can detect the units in the image from left to right: the spindle, the step motor, the motor drive and the Raspberry Pi. There are no guides for the spindle here. The motor takes 5 voltage from the Raspberry Pi. My software is named USB Cam Mover. The base movement depends on the near point distance of the scene. With the embedded values, the movement is calculated in parts of the near distance. Looping through this list gives the camera position. Please consider that the near point distance can be only a few centimeters and gives very short base distances. It'll work perfect for lenticular photos as well. After taking the last image, the camera moves back to the starting position. The flowchart of the software illustrates the 2 loops. After setting and previewing, the controls are stored, starting with defaults or repeating the last settings is possible. The outer loop is the base bracketing, the inner loop runs the focus bracketing. No, we don't dive into the Python source code, but if anyone is interested in the source code, he can download it from my server. Please request per email. Finishing the shooting requires transfer of the image to the host PC. An alternative to the automatic transfer is the use of a FTP client. The slide displays FileZilla, so we have a comfortable access to the corresponding directories. There are several focus tagging software packages available. A good freeware is Picolay, Affinity Photo, Adobe Shop, Focus Projects, and others do all the same job. Select the software according to your favorite flavor. We detect our friend Captain Scarlet in a Spectrum security car, well focused in the stacked image. I don't have to talk about the stereo editing software to this auditorium. You know it best yourself. Let us now watch a short video sequence to observe the described process. The source of my research is Captain Scarlet, a carton book printed 2001. You can buy this and merchandising items from eBay and find the original episodes on YouTube. Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons is a British science fiction television series created by Gary and Sylvia Anderson. The series were filmed using marionette puppetry combined with the scale model special effects sequences. Running 25-minute episodes, it was the first broadcast 1967. The story in very short. It is the year 2068. The Mysterons are sworn enemies of the Earth. They are going to destroy the world. Leading the fight against the Mysterons is one man that fate has made indestructible. His name is Captain Scarlet from the Spectrum, a worldwide security organization. For better anaglyph quality, 100-second slideshow follows the presentation. My 3D Captain Scarlet gallery is prepared to view via the web with the HTML5 viewer. Please visit the site and view the stereos as you like. Finally, I have to thank you for joining the workshop. Set up your anaglyph glasses now.
Big round of applause. That was some amazing stuff. Thank you, Dr. Pomaska, for that. We have some, I don't see any, we have time for a couple questions in the chat. I know that there are people who are saying very inspiring, very interesting things. One question was if you're able to make the slides available for people later on. I guess some of the information was covered up a little bit.
Yes, the slides are available, and for those people who like to try the Raspberry Pi, I added a step-by-step installation guide for setting up the Raspberry Pi headless. So you use the Raspberry Pi without a keyboard, without a monitor. You need an internet connection and a PC, and you can set up your machine. And this is a procedure you must be informed about. It's not difficult, but including the OpenCV installation, it maybe needs some hints for the beginners.
Yep. I could see that. So here's some new images are so much fun, effective focus stacking. A lot of excitement in the chat.
I especially like the image of the computer repair where the tool of use was a hammer. That was a nice touch.
Sometimes that's the most effective tool.
Usually I'm using the much smaller model figures. The scale is 1/87, not 83 as shown in the slides. And you need a lot of shops until you find the correct scene or a scene that is sufficient. And therefore I move the camera automatic in maybe 4 positions. It starts at 1/30 of the distance, goes up to 1/20 to the distance, and that are sometimes a couple of hundred pictures which are recorded. And therefore this procedure for organizing the file names is important if you have hundreds of files, and to see the stacking results. And you need some experience for the stacking because too much is not good, and to adjust the focus distance with a correct interval, so you can go step 3 or step 5, and something depends on the camera. Somewhere I wrote or I said that you can't use any cameras. There are 4K cameras on the market which are still garbage. I don't say what company it is, but I have only good experiences with Microsoft and this Logitech.
So Michael Toth is saying, so the primary advantage of this USB cam and Pi setup over the smartphone cameras are the image controls and being able to control the motor rig to move the camera automatically and play with lens intervals, ? Okay, if anybody has any questions, you can go down to the reactions tab, click on that and raise the hand and we'll get to you. And thank you to the people in AltSpace as well. We have a couple people out there who are watching. It's exciting. If anybody has any questions in there, you can go over to the moderator and they can pass them back to real life. And I suppose
I'd like to thank Rick that he put me on the list for this workshop. Thank you, Rick.
Well, you're very welcome. It was a well worthwhile workshop for us to see.
We should open this up for questions for Gordon too.
Yep. So at this point, yeah, if you have any questions for Gordon as well, either put them in the chat or go down to reactions and click raise your hand and we'll get to you.
Yep. Also, if you watch the YouTube archived version of this later, you can also, of course, comment questions on that video, and I'll be checking them.
There's a question in the chat. Instead of webcams, can we use larger res cams? How do we do it? This is for the tabletop.
Yes, I'm using the V2 camera, and the new one is a HQ from Raspberry Pi. But the HQ has this disadvantage that it has a manual focus control only. And you must set the aperture, manual, both. So you can maybe set up an installation that the distance from the camera to the object is moving. The V2 camera is very useful. I use this. It's a 8 megabyte camera, and the shortest distance is about 6 centimeter or so. I'm not exactly sure now, but it should be 6 centimeter.
Okay, so it looks like we got Carlton Bright with his hand raised high up in the air. Carlton, if you want to unmute. There you go. I think you, okay.
Question for Gordon. Near the end, you showed two depth maps that were made by two different companies, and they showed. Oh, it was it was the guy with the it's the guy.
Was this Mr. Rogers in front of like the tabletop? Okay.
It showed two different, and one with, they were both similar but quite little different.
Right.
Which is fascinating because it's almost like you could play games with that, in a fascinating way. But my question is, could you potentially make a wireframe of the original 2D, and in your second go round on fine tuning, take that wireframe and put it over the depth map and nip and tuck it into?
Yeah, I'm not so knowledgeable about kind of building those complete 3D models and the wireframes, but I do know that, so the last AI that I went over, the 3D photo in painting, it does work by creating a I think it's a PNY file. I'm not sure, but basically it does, as part of its process, it does create a very large 3D model file. And I think you can import that into standard programs. I know Ugo Capetto, he has, I think he has his depth player web app. I think, for example, you can open it in that and get an essentially a 3D model that you can rotate and move around. Like I said, I haven't done much of that myself, but I believe, using that file or by converting that, you could probably import that into like Unity and probably mess around with that in terms of 3D modeling, but I'm not sure.
But it opens up so many new territories here. It's really a fascinating presentation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's really thrilling. It's thrilling to see what we can do now.
Yeah, it's there's crazy possibilities. Yeah.
I missed that part a little bit, but I have seen that PLY file gets exported when you.
Oh yes, that's the one. Thank you.
Yeah. So I've opened that and thought, like, wow, I could picture myself in VR and just picking the bits and putting it, making the occlusion in back of it. And it's an exciting world with all that. Oh, another question for Dr. Pomaska: how to prevent? Well, two questions. The first one is, have you done this outside rather than indoors? And then also, how do you prevent shadows that complicate the stereo and focus stacking?
This is my outside camera.
Oh, okay.
It is a camera head from Hadecam and V2, so the IMX219 sensor. The question of shadow is difficult. I make some outdoor shots. I do stacking as well. And with my Python procedure, I reduce all the moving objects. So I can make shoots in the street without people. And maybe this is a possibility to prevent the complicated shadows.
Great. Dave Heiser.
Yeah, Gordon, at one time you mentioned that you can convert a color depth map to a grayscale. Is there any special way you do that, or does the color depth map convert easily into a correct grayscale?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the program that I talked about that used a color depth map was the Midas version 3, and that uses the Viridis. It's kind of that green and yellow color map scheme. But yes, I think that color map scheme is designed so if you simply desaturate the colors or convert it using any standard image program to grayscale, it should work fairly well, but there is a more exact way to do it, and it's kind of complicated. You have to use a program like MATLAB, or I've written a script for it in ImageMagick, which requires you to use a terminal in Mac. But there is an exact way to map from that palette to grayscale. But if you just do it in a quick and dirty method, it should still work generally okay.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
Mr. Kurland.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question for Gordon. First off, Gordon, I want to really thank you so much, not just for investigating all of this, but for also making some notebooks that we can use to get our stuff through the collab without having to navigate all of the intricacies of how it works.
Yeah, I mean,
I took a look at the page. Yeah. And your instructions are fantastic as to how to use it.
Well, thanks. Basically I went through the trouble of figuring out how to use it, and a lot of troubleshooting myself. So I figured I'd save everyone else the time.
Leads to my question. I know that these algorithms continue changing at a rapid pace, and new ones are always coming out too. Like for instance, I actually just ran a test on the Midas 3, and it looks like one of the modules isn't there anymore. But will you be continuing to add and update this as things keep moving along?
Well, for the so yeah, if people open the link page for my workshop, so there are a variety of notebooks, and some are by the creators of these AIs, and some are by basically their associates who in some cases just volunteered to make notebooks. And then of course you'll see, as Eric was just talking about, I have some custom ones for some of the AI programs. So my custom ones, I will try to update those so they continue to work. And already for the boosting monocular depth one, there's a bug fix version that I've made, because it doesn't work, I feel like, about half the time. But of course it's trying to play catch up sometimes with those things that change. I haven't run the Midas one in a while, so I'll have to check that out. But if you are familiar, a person familiar with a Colab or even Python programming, which I am not, you can go to the project pages, which are hosted on GitHub, where they have the complete code and usually notes and things. So if something doesn't work, if you have the know-how, you can try and look up what's going on there. But hopefully they would update their official notebooks, with any changes. So yeah, I'll take a look at that one.
I've played with Colab a little bit, and I wanted to thank you again. Having the structured notebook with the instructions really makes it simple to follow through and put the files through the process. So thank you for doing that.
Great, I'm glad. Thanks.
Right. Look forward to checking that out. So in a second, we're going to have a question from David Richardson, but I wanted to ask Guenter a question from the chat, which is, have you seen the Raspberry Pi or the Stereo Pi V2?
Yes, I had the Stereo Pi presented at the Lübeck Congress in 19? I think 19. But I don't use it now because it is with the compute module, and I don't like this compute module. It's not so universal. And they are coming now with a new version of this. It's on the way. I think people have to wait a few weeks until they have their the backers until they have their gifts.
Right.
So with the first version, I made a few pictures only, but it's working. It's nice. As I stated before, you can dive into computer vision with this tool. You have the source code. You can experiment with the code if you like, and it's a great stuff.
Right, and this new version has, you can use your own lenses, I believe, so you could expand
Yes.
that.
There are a lot of lenses existing, and the latest is that AutoCam makes a focusable unit. You can buy a small motor-driven unit to put it on the lens. So we have the camera board. It is around 2 by 3 centimeters, I think, and the camera itself is very small. As you see here, on maybe you can see it on this, so you can dismount the camera. The brown, yeah, the brown color around this is the camera, and this is the connection. So you can put the camera off, put the AutoCam autofocus on, and the camera again on. Other people dismount this lens and put the extension on it. And for the extension, you know, these are the M12 mounts, very cheap, plastic or metal, maybe $1 or so. And here you have the unit to change the lenses. For example, they have now a 360 lens and panoramic units.
All right, great. Let's pop over to David Richardson. You have your hand up there.
All right. First off, I want to say thank you very much to both of the presenters sharing their information and knowledge. It's always very helpful and very useful. I do have a question for Gordon. I've been playing with the Midas 2 and with the Lorez for a bit, not so much with what's been going on with Midas 3 for that. I do find some issues with each of those. Do you have a preference for them? And have you tried combining them? What do you see? I see a lot of problems, for example, with image that I have as my background. I did a conversion for that one, but I see floating feet where they're not attached to the ground correctly. So they obviously need some work. What are your suggestions and recommendations for those kind of things?
Yeah, good question. And by the way, David, I think you did a presentation, right, for a 3D club about also using some AI. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah,
I actually at that time I wasn't using the Midas one. I literally picked up the Midas one about a week later. But I had actually done some of this, some similar things to what you covered in this one. Not to the level of detail, but yes.
But yeah, if you'd like, of course, you should drop the link to that in the chat so people can check it out. But to answer your question, so do you mean using the boosting monocular depth or not that one? Just Lorez versus Midas? Are you asking about?
I've been using Midas 2 versus Lorez, and
okay.
Then I played a little bit with Midas 3, but I have some trouble getting that one to work properly.
Gotcha.
So most of the examples that you gave today, it looked like that you were using Midas 2 versus Lorez. I didn't see as much with the Midas 3. You said it was simpler, but you didn't show as many examples of that. So I don't know if you have a preference there or not.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, part of the complication is, so there's the, if you use the boosting monocular depth, that you get much more detail, right, in your depth maps, but that only works with Midas 2.1, and Midas 3 is just a little more accurate converting in general. So the question already posed by that is, do you want to use the boosting? Do you want to have it boosted with more detail, or do you want it more accurate but smaller? So that's the question of whether or not to use that boosting algorithm. But as for between Midas and Lorez, I think I found that as I just said briefly in the presentation, that Midas does better with people generally. Lorez does a lot better with background details, and I think better with like just buildings and perhaps natural scenes.
Say architecture, I found it better for that.
Yeah, but and I think there's a particular weakness of Lorez where somehow it'll make people's heads be a little forward of their bodies. I don't know how that's a bias came to be in its training, but yeah, what I'll do is to answer your question about how to decide between those functionally, I'll just usually run both. And I don't think I've tried, only when I've been doing like composite 3D images have I, but on occasion, yeah, I will take the depth maps from both and then use portions of each. I haven't done that with like a traditional photograph, but I have done that with kind of photo collages where I think part of the, like this strip works better in Low-res and this one works better with Midas or something. Yeah.
So then are you cutting out pieces to be able to make a
Yes.
combined
Yeah.
image? Okay.
Yeah. I would only do that if it were kind of a collage image or it was otherwise, you know, not hours of Photoshop work to blend the depth maps. Yeah.
Then are you just using a stereo photo maker to bring them back as a finished stereo pair if you're doing that?
Yes, for still images, I'm using SPM to do that. But for the animations, I'm sometimes using SPM and sometimes that 3D photo and painting AI.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. Good question.
Thank you, David. And I've got Erica's hand raised.
Yeah. I just want to apologize and point out that something very interesting when you're using Colab is make sure you don't skip a step. The Midas 3 is working, but I hadn't loaded the TIM module, which is the first step before you actually upload your picture.
Yes, yeah, it can be tricky to skip a single line. Yep.
Yeah, so make sure when you're doing any of this Colab stuff that you actually do all of them in the proper sequence. And then it works really, really well. And I had just ended up with a fantastic depth map from a picture that I didn't think I was going to be able to get one from. So thank you again.
And you just did that, Eric, is that right?
I just did that on my second laptop while we were talking.
Wow.
Between the time I spoke before and the time I did it now. You know what? Go on with what you're doing. I'll bring it over and we'll see how the image looks.
Yeah, it can be pretty quick, really. Mm-hmm.
I'm super excited to see your different, let me see, let me add the spotlight myself. To see your steps, because like a lot of 3D things, you get things working once and then you stop and you come back like 2 months later and you've forgotten all of your steps. So it's great that you've documented the steps so that we can use in the future.
Isn't it great that we have recordings of workshops on YouTube where people can go look at them and do everything exactly as instructed without missing anything? That's just a wonderful thing.
Yeah. Any more questions? I'm not sure if we answered this. So over a period of time, the linked AI gets missed or updates or upgrades. Then what happens to the dependency? Does that break?
Yeah, it depends. It's like, you know, it's like if the program works, it works. But if it doesn't, there are a million reasons why, possible reasons why it doesn't work. Again, if you're kind of more technically minded, what I've done before is actually for the boosting monocular depth for that algorithm, it was broken about 2 weeks ago, like after I started making the video featuring it, and I was afraid it was going to be completely broken when I did this workshop and no one would be able to use it. But I got in touch with some of the programmers via GitHub. I opened an error report. There are all these things you could do. So in some cases, if there's a program, if there's an error, you can try to contact people and see if they can help you out and or fix their own programs. But other than that, it's like I said, there could be a lot of reasons something is not working, and these are complicated programs. So.
And someone asked Dr. Pomaska, is that a multi-viewer in the back of the room?
Yeah, it's a viewer with 6 pairs of 35mm slides inside. These are slides I made 20 years ago, I think, and I found this viewers, the small 35mm viewers, and I made this woodwork just for fun, because the tools should be in use. The woodwork tools. Yeah, a mini Kaiser panorama. Okay.
So I think we're kind of running up against it here. But we do have another half hour until the stereo theater starts. So definitely make sure to check out the stereo theater on YouTube. And Eric, did you find, did your picture appear?
Jim Frazier has a question while I'm just transferring it from that laptop to this laptop.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Gordon, do you specify a palette, a color palette in some way for the colorization software? Thanks.
Let's see, for that one that's made by Deep AI, no, you don't. I don't think you're able to choose any aspect of that yourself. But if you open the link page, there are two models of the AI that they've released. I think one is their default, and one is and they call it artistic one, which I believe kind of uses just brighter, more saturated colors. So those are your options for that particular AI. But I know there are other colorizing AIs out there, and even some other ones on Google Colab if you look around. And in those cases, I'm not sure. You might be able to. I know there are phone apps which will allow you to like take the color palette from one photo and apply it to another photo. If you've seen some of those, I don't remember I think there's one called like Color Thief or something. So you could always try doing something like that. It's like colorizing a photo first using AI, but then stealing a color palette from another photo to further edit it.
All right, thanks.
Sure.
Someone wanted to see a camera again, the outside camera. This is the infrared hyper stereo version. A 0W is enough for this, and a battery, and attached is a clock. And I can use the cameras controlled, remote controlled both. I can change the baseline for hyper stereo and infrared. The filters are gone. And this one is a fixed base length. It is 80 millimeters. And here you can see the board with the two cameras on it.
Do you have an intervalometer in your software for time lapse?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
An intervalometer so that you can do time lapse?
No, I don't know the synchronizing of this, but the former version of this camera, they use the same clock. Both cameras use the same clock, and it should be. They say it's total synchronized, but I don't know the time.
Okay, great.
This one goes with TCP/IP and a special procedure, and it is not very good synchronized, but for my hyperstereos infrared, for the application, it's sufficient.
I like how you've got the red and the blue on the sides of the camera, so that if they get disattached, you can put them. Is that so you can assemble it in the field as well?
Do you mean this?
Yeah, you have the red and the blue colors for the right and the left. So if you take it apart and put it back together.
Yeah, I don't know left and right. I'm confusing this left and right, and therefore I use it from the Marines. They say here in Germany, Steuerbord and Backbord. I think in English it's a harbor side and seaside. I'm not sure.
Okay.
A joke.
Dave Heiser, is there something similar?
I think
port and starboard.
Carlton, did you want to add something?
No, he answered it.
He did. Okay.
There's a company in the flow chart he mentioned was too new. Lopez.
Yes. Yeah. Carlton was just asking. On the flow chart, I said there was a a program that didn't make it on the flowchart, but I did cover it later. That was the LaRes with boosting monocular depth. It's just not on that first slide.
Okay, so here I just loaded. This is what I just ran through Gordon's notebook.
Sorry, just muted everyone.
There we-
Eric.
yeah. No, that's okay. I'm back. So yeah, so this I just took, this is my like Facebook header, and I just downloaded it, ran it through the script, and I thought, with all that black, is it even going to find anything? And it did. It's not perfect. It needs some tweaking, but it actually worked much better than I expected it to.
And is the tweaking done within this program?
Well, I was just looking at it in Stereo Photo Maker, but you can, I mean, I could take just the depth map portion into Photoshop and paint in adjustments as needed, and work with the depth that way.
Yeah, I
also
often
I have this rather old program out of Japan called ST Paint from a company called Texnay that lets me actually paint a depth map over an image. And I like to bring things into there to do depth map adjustments.
Yeah, I was going to say, Eric, I think that's really the kind of the name of the game in a lot of cases with these AI programs that create depth maps. Is like, is it passable enough for your use, or do you want to spend time, touching it up, depending on what application it is?
Right. Well, in this case, I just want to upload it back to Facebook, and this is perfect for that. So.
Nice.
Thanks again for the presentation and for providing so much information on your website.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks again for both presentations. Another round of applause, since I've got drunk with power with the assist applause button. Switch to the applause view. Hooray. Okay, so that concludes this this session. So we'll see you in half an hour for the Stereo Theater.
Before we sign off, Dave, I'd like to just collectively thank all 10 workshop presenters at this convention. It's been great. Thank you very much.
Another round of applause.
And thank you, Dave and Rick and Eric and the second Dave and Steve and all the NSA team.
Thanks, guys. Okay, and then we'll see at another, so we have the 3D Theater, and then later on, we'll have a closing reception for the Trade Fair and the Art Gallery in Gathertown at 3:30 Pacific. And then we have Digital Image Showcase later tonight at, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. I'm on Eastern time. I don't know what time it is. but yeah, show up for the Digital Image Showcase later tonight.
I think it's 4:30 Pacific. 7:30 Eastern.
7:30.
That look right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, take it away, Dave.